And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're having a discussion in the context of the new Diffs blueprint. Today, the focus is the front-end architecture. And we'll expand a bit more on what that means in just a second. Thanks, everybody, for making the time and for everybody watching this. I wanted to start just by giving a bit of an introduction of what we're trying to accomplish here today. We have been doing great work in advancing the architecture as a whole of what is going to be the overall arching strategy for everything. And Stanislav has done a great job at materializing that into a POC. And to do that, he's been leveraging some, stale code that we've had in the repository diffs to start off with. And ideally, we will be having the opportunity to rethink a lot of those things because that's old code, it's old assumptions, that sort of thing. So we've done a great job at sweating out the details between how the HTML gets to the browser, how we glue that with the dynamic parts of the front-end applications. But if you remember, one of the concerns or one of the goals here in this project is to improve the maintainability of the project. And throughout the last couple of years, we've been learning a lot of lessons from what works, what doesn't work, not to mention the overall engineering concept we all learn and love, right? So today's conversation is going to be, right, assuming that we have the server-side rendering, assuming that we get the web components as glue for the server-side rendered HTML and the front-end work, what's going to be our decisions in terms of architecture for the front-end code exclusively from that moment on to ensure that we have, separation of concerns, or we have the single responsibility components, or everything that we want to make sure that we have for the new generation of Diffs code. This is the moment to have that discussion. Now, I don't expect us to have an outcomes right now on this call. There will be more discussions, asynchronous discussions, things to write down. But right now, I just wanted to open the floor to kind of have your old perspective. Thomas did send us an email a while ago, last week, to focus on the section that's been already published as a proposal. I hope you all took some time to read it. Yeah, so that's basically the thing. The only thing I wanted to say, because it came up on last week's call, is this change in approach is going to introduce some restrictions and some things that we might not be able to do so easily. So right away, one of the things that came to mind is right now we allow the user to switch between inline and parallel mode, which, given that we have a fully structured data on the state that allows us to re-render the diff lines markup or front-end code, it's pretty much done on the fly. Now, what does that mean for this new reality? Would we re-request the server-side rendered HTML from the server? Is there any particular concerns we have to take care in terms of architecture to make sure that all of those decisions, all of those things that we want to be able to do, we're still able to do? So stuff like when we get a new diffs from the server, are we able to just absorb that and just continue the life cycle of the applications, or is everything torn down and just bootstrapped again? So let's think about these things. And even if you don't have a specific proposal, please ask questions and try to come up with potential things to discuss. Yeah, I see we have one point in the agenda, so I'll move over to Stanislav and to talk over what you have in mind, and then potentially, Thomas, I would love to have you give a bit of an overview of your take as well. So, Stas.
Thanks. Yeah, I would love to also ask some questions like how exactly we are going to implement this, like how it's going to behave for the user when we try to switch modes. For example, right now, if we turn off white space changes, it will basically redraw all the diffs, but without page reload. And we might want to preserve that, so we need to consider this thing for the new architecture as well. And I've prepared some proposal linked in the agenda. So it tries to basically abstract away some of the implementation details from the actual functionality code. It does so by giving 3 layers to the architecture. The lowest layer is the diff wrapper layer. It will be implemented using web components. It is used for handling data that's coming from the Rails. It will provide low-level DOM manipulation abstractions like inserting rows, removing rows, adding new elements to the diff element. It will also provide notifications, for example, when a diff file is visible in the viewport, when it's actually mounted, when it's unmounted. And it will also register plugins, which is a second layer. So plugins are the connecting layer between components and diff wrapper. Basically, it takes the events that are coming from components or callbacks and assigning them to proper diff wrapper methods, and also providing data that's coming from the diff wrapper. As the components are just modules, they can be few components, they can be third-party modules or on custom JavaScript. And I can share the screen. Few seconds. Yeah, components is the highest level. Basically, these are our most business logic focused modules. So for example, we'll be hosting discussions, code quality stuff here, and they will interact directly with plugins. Components won't be able to call diff wrapper methods directly. That will make them more robust in terms of refactoring or moving our existing components code into a new paradigm. I also provided some example code, but this is really, really general code. Don't treat this as exact implementation of this approach. But basically, diff wrappers will register the plugins. They will provide some context. It doesn't have to be like this, but just for example. They will provide events and also some methods not shown here. And the plugins will do the actual work of connecting these pieces together. So for example, if we have a diff discussions component, the plugin will watch for when the diff file is actually mounted, because that can happen at any time of the application lifecycle. It will manage some store if we have it, and then it will try to draw the actual component by using provided methods from the diff wrapper. For example, this extend row and reduce row. And that is basically how I envision it to work. And this is a small graph showing the data flow in this architecture. Yep, I think that's it.
Cool, thanks. I think there's a lot of similarities to things that we have been discussing in the past, and I see some bits here that I see also in the diagram we have already proposed by Thomas. Thomas, do you want to weigh in? How does this compare to what you had put forth?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities to what I'm putting forth. Yeah. I think my main concern with this is, let's say the security team would like to add a plugin. Instead of hooking into existing lifecycle events that we have, they would actually go in and add a plugin to the list of plugins, right? Is that right? They would add it to the array of, in your example code, it wouldn't have to be this exactly.
We could use code coverage as an example, right?
Yeah.
So Stas, the code coverage would be what? Would have a plugin for code coverage? and then eventually components?
Yep.
So, but then I think one of the things that it's important to understand is like in this case, how would we delegate responsibilities for like loading data from network or not? And how would that be going into the plugin, and then the components wouldn't have access to that? How did you have that in mind, Stas?
That depends on the data you're requesting. You mean server data or like client side data?
Well, the idea, I was vague on purpose because, of course, initially it has to come from the server somehow, but it's not completely excluded in my mind that we could potentially leverage some client-side caching more aggressively, like in XDB, and put some of those things in there. So the question is, who loads the data, wherever it comes from, whether it's local cache or the server? Would we designate that, or would it be a bit more free for interpretation for the people writing each plugin and components?
Well, in this proposal, I think of diff wrapper as the provider for the data coming from server initially that we need right away. And for anything else, like discussions, that can be managed outside of this architecture. So you can connect to any adapter. You can use Rails, or you can use REST, you can use GraphQL to get the data, and we are not bound to a specific architecture in these terms. So plugins can actually request some data, pass it down to the underlying component, and that's how it can work in one of the implementations. So it gives you some freedom in how you manage data.
Just slightly different than your view, right, Thomas? In the diagram, I remember there was a strong separation and a stricter separation, I would say, between those responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, saying it's totally different is, I mean, we can get to what I'm talking about, so everyone can draw their own conclusions. But I think both Stas and I are like suggesting a like your plugin can load data however you want, and I'm suggesting maybe we have a little bit more strict structure on data, but still it's like off somewhere else. And so like if like there's freedom there on both of them. So I don't think they're like so diametrically opposed.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just because I was watching a lot of like you have the event hub being sort of like the direct access to the network, but I'm probably misreading that on the new diffs blueprint.
Yeah, do you want me to cover that stuff now?
Yeah, I think we all got a snapshot of it, but we haven't really have a presentation from you. So I think we could spend a few minutes of you just pitching that view.
Yeah.
You can use your article, or you can use the blueprints, whatever you're more.
It's probably best for us to start with the blueprint because that's what's ours rather than my blog post. In fact, I will share my screen here so that we can. This is the original document that I created that was translated into a mermaid diagram in the actual blueprint doc. The mermaid diagram kind of sucks. You can spend a lot of time getting things to line up like this, but it's a huge hassle. So this is kind of the original document. So you'll see that it's sort of split up similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly to what Stas is suggesting. The difference, I think the major difference is that instead of like, I would probably put plugins as like what I'm calling application logic, rather than like UI stuff. So application logic, rather than those two things communicating directly, they communicate over like a standardized messaging protocol. So if the UI detects a click or whatever, it sends a message, and then the plugin can respond to that message, or any number of plugins can respond to that message. And then I guess the major difference here would be like how data is handled is a little bit more defined here. It similarly, it uses the event hub to ask for stuff. So if the application logic needs to load data, it would send a message and say, I need discussions, or I need this diff, or whatever. And then the data access would handle that, and it would determine where that's coming from. So whether that's from a cached version in IndexedDB, or it needs to go out and ask for it from our API, wherever it gets that from, that's abstracted away from our logic. I also suggested this is a big difference, but I also suggested just using WebSockets and like just sending like single socket requests to the backend so that it can give us data without having to use REST. But that's separate. So earlier you said, you from the diagram in the Mermaid doc, you saw the event hub like directly accessing data. That's just sort of an artifact of how the Mermaid diagram looks. It really is its own separate code that's just like communicating over the event hub with standardized like message blocks. And you can think of those as the same sort of structure as like Flux actions, like where they have a name, like, or a mutation where you like give it a name and then it runs some piece of code. I don't want to draw strong comparisons to any Flux implementation because I think they're all let's see, we are streaming live. I think most Flux implementations probably are not the most efficient way to do things, but like if you think of how actions and mutations are named and you can just sort of call them, that's what I would think of as like the event hub, calling other like code that hooks into it. I did link a blog post which expands on this a bit. If you want to look at like this, I suppose I could share my screen, and this is just sort of a slightly expanded version of the same chart with a little bit more detail of like each piece connects to any other piece. A component renders DOM. This would probably be what Stas is talking about with like web components here, where like this stuff is updating our HTML from the backend. We can also split up into pages. I would prefer we handle pages not with Rails, but it's probably more efficient to do that since we already have that structure set up, and so on. That blog post that I wrote is pretty large, and you're welcome to read it, but this is sort of this is the end game here of it. So there's the blueprint, 5 pieces.
So take us through those 5 pieces very quickly. Were those the boxes that you just shared?
Yes, essentially they are. Yeah. It basically says application split into 4 pieces. So there's a data layer, and then there's what your application does, your value proposition, like the code. Then there's display stuff. So that's an artifact of your application, not the application itself. So there's like a whole section for displaying. And then there's the actual rendering artifact of that, which is the UI. There's the step that says communication is always passed among these major parts using like a standardized message system. And then the idea that data reflects database information, not application state. So that defines what is stored in data versus state management, because those are 2 like really complex things and they're very different. This is a pretty specific suggestion, but I think it's important that like your application's state is managed in state machines in components so that you know exactly how to get into and out of various states. And then finally, DOM updates are managed by the web components family of things, basically. So only updating the dynamic bits and using these technologies that are efficient in the browser. So
Got it. Thank you.
It is
would
not
hope no one.
necessarily easy, but the best things never are. So
Oh, that was a nice nugget. Yeah, I can see the value of all that. The thing that was coming to my mind is it feels like in Stanislav, you had in your proposal you had something like so you had an import for the state. So I'm guessing that there's some shared state that you get to share between pretty much every layer, or at least some of them. And Thomas, you would be proposing that the states would be a little bit more confined in each one of the parts.
yes and no. I would say that like application level state, which I can't think of an example right now, but there's some state that would be communicated with an event. So like, hey, this piece of state has changed. Here's the new value of it. And whoever needs to like respond to that can like respond to the event. If it's just a component level state, like this view has been switched to parallel view or whatever, that's something that like can just be stored locally on the component.
Got it. Stas, I'm going to share a little bit your view for the state because I had a question here about what did you envision to handle that state?
In my architecture, actually, there is no strict rules how you manage your state, but as a general approach, you would mostly handle state in your plugin. Like your plugin will work as your state management system. And from there, you can use Vuex, you can use something else, you can use Apollo client. It doesn't really matter. It just connects the pieces together and basically abstracts the state management from you. But it doesn't have a strict requirement for using a specific architecture or a technology.
Okay, so it's agnostic.
This is done on purpose because we have already a mixture of GraphQL, of REST API, of other bunch of technologies. And with that approach, we can easily reintegrate this stuff into the server-side rendered diffs. After that, we can decide on a better architecture because the decision can take us months before we start actually implementing stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be fair. Thomas?
That's true. Yeah, that's very true. On the other hand, I would say that momentum is a huge driver of things in software. Particularly, I don't know if it's especially bad at GitLab or not, but once we have something in place, if it's this like amalgamation of all of the things that we've done so far, it's gonna be really hard to undo that. And so like we'll live with that forever. We'll live with kind of the current system. If we reintegrate our current system, we'll just have the same thing that we've done before.
That's very similar to something I was going to say. So one of the things that we want to take the opportunity here is to cut the things that have been causing us pain. So it's a good moment for us, for example, any parts of the application that are overly complex or too tightly coupled with each other or something like that. Now's the time to decouple them, not when the MVC is out. So, and of course, there's going to be multiple layers to this. I was thinking about stuff like all the logic we have for suggestions, so to speak, making a suggestion, all that stuff. We're probably going to be reusing that at the very edge of the application. But when we're talking about the comments primitives, I would say, I think we're going to have to re-envision the whole primitives for comments as a whole, to support all these scenarios and all these, acting as the middle layer between the DOM and the dynamic applications that we're using right now. I think we're definitely going to need to rewrite a lot of that logic to begin with. But so the architecture being agnostic doesn't really force us to reuse everything. So I think that's the key takeaway here, is that even though we don't prescribe anything in specific, we can create guidelines for what are the cases where we would reuse verbatim where we have. So those are potentially discussions for later. But so coming back to the state, I think, right. Okay. I had a question. So by the way, keep adding questions to the agenda so that way we don't forget to bring things up as we go. I just wanted to clarify. So as I'm thinking about it, I'm seeing this event-driven like theme through both proposals. I think from there's a slight difference where I think Stas, your proposal is actually to use the DOM level events. You're using the add event listener there, and I think Thomas, you're using sort of an event hub, which would be sort of like a library or something, like a pub sub cloud thing, like the one we're using.
I think we could use DOM events pretty easily for that, like triggering a custom event, dispatching, creating custom events.
Is that correct, Stanislav? My read on it, is that what you're proposing?
It doesn't have to be like this. It's just an example. You can use DOM events, you can use custom event hub. It doesn't really matter.
Also, okay, not prescribed. Okay, so what I'm thinking is now, and I'm guessing that those events would have some sort of like global visibility, or at least global in the application visibility, which is to say that, for example, if I want to add telemetry tracking to the application, I'm guessing that will be its own separate plugin from, you know, the UI components and all that stuff. And then eventually it would be, the hooks would be through events, or it'd be something like publish a comment that would throw a message on the event cloud. I'm trying to avoid some specific terms, but we would throw an event there, and then the telemetry could pick up on that and like not have to go to the code of the component to wire things in. Am I reading that right?
It's totally doable. Like we can organize it in such a way that every event published on the diff file will be visible to every plugin. It's definitely possible.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful to not, and I think we're not doing that, but we might be picking things up that we want to have to maintain ourselves that could be potentially provided either by, you know, browser native features or specific libraries or something like that. So we don't want to be basically putting ourselves in the position that we're going to have to maintain a lot of things that are, you know, complex. Let's put it that way. Just a thought. Okay. And I like that. That's part of the loose the loose coupling that we need. Because correct me if I'm wrong, right now, if you want to use telemetry and we want to add hooks onto the behaviors that we have in the application, we would go to the components that are actually triggering those things and trigger that behavior of sending a tracking signal or something. That will be done at the component level, correct?
Most definitely, yes.
Okay.
Also,
cool.
One of the goals of the plugins is to actually simplify migration to a proper way of handling your remote data, managing local states. So right now, all of this is done inside components. And usually when you open components of the diffs right now, it's really hard to track down your inputs and outputs, like what the component does and how much state does it need. I experienced this on myself when I was working on the diffs SSR POC, because it was really hard to understand what data component actually needs, because it's all in the Vuex, and this data is spread across multiple layers of components. And plugins should actually provide a good abstraction to figure out what data exactly do you need and which events your components are creating.
Let me write that down. I think so. One of the things we could do, so the plugins would provide a good abstraction to define what inputs it takes, and what did you say exactly? What inputs it takes, and
what events it can publish. Basically, the interface of your components.
Got it.
I think that particular problem is why it's really important that we move data to its own whole layer of the application, because right now, like in today's world, the way that data is handled is we just like dump as much as we can into a data store and then pull out chunks and pieces where it's needed, and it's like everything is ad hoc. I think we should really define that, like how does data come in, how does it get mutated, and then how does it come out, so that we have all those steps broken down. And what Stanislav is describing is like the plugin can manage that, like how its data comes in. We might be able to move that layer up to like be part of the data layer and say, here's a abstraction of data for the file tree. Here's the abstraction of data for a diff file or whatever. And we know where those like adapters go, and anyone who needs that adapter can use it.
Let me ask you a dumb question. When we're talking about this data layer and everything, what's the closest tool we have at our disposal today at GitLab, front-end code, that would come close to that? So for example, the question that's in the back of my mind, like I know that Apollo Cache provides some layer for caching requests and all that stuff, but it also does a lot more. Would that be it? Or is it something completely new?
Well, I mean, it depends. It depends what your beliefs are, right? If if you believe that your network access should also be managing your data storage, then it would be Apollo. If you believe that a global variable should be managing all of your data, then it would be like a Vuex getter, right? But yeah, I mean, you don't need a tool to do this really, right? Like you could write a function that gets data and massages it into the format you need for whatever adapter you're writing, and it doesn't have to be a tool.
Sure. Anyone has more thoughts on that?
I would like to add that I really love the data access layer that Thomas described. I think, yes, we have troubles with getting data that can be cached locally. So we need to basically manually handle that in every single case. And having that data layer would help with most of these cases. And one of the great things about plugins is that it doesn't enforce you how you manage your data. So you can actually add this data layer on top of it, use it alongside plugins, and it will work with that as well.
Got it. Thank you. All right, I'll move on so that we can cover more topics. One of the things that has been on my mind is this dichotomy that we've established as pretty mature at this point, about having the static content that comes server-side rendered from the server and the dynamic content that gets rendered through the front-end application. To this day, we send, apart from like the rendered HTML line for the diffs, we send structured data down the pipe, and then the front end takes care of everything, including writing what will now be the static content. Now that we move for server-side rendered static content, which would be the diff lines of the files, we'll probably be able to skip a bunch of data, right? For example, we're not going to need the lines to come as they come today, the content of the lines. However, what about the metadata of those lines? Will we be able to put that, or should we even put that on the markup as like markers on the markup? Or will we still need to send most of that data anyway, just have some sort of like way of connecting that structure of data with the raw HTML line, diff line? Have you given even any thought to this? And any of you? So the question, do we know already what data we'll be sending on top of the server-side render markup, like the dynamic part?
If you're talking about raw line data, like the exactly line coming from Gitly or Git, I don't think we'll need to do that, but I'm not sure. I know that we have, for example, we have an insert suggestion button, which actually needs the exact line text, but that can be mitigated. We can use API for that, for example, just not to overwhelm the client with amount of data. I think we can deal with that stuff. And as far as I see, we don't really need to send all the data we have right now with the diffs on the first render. We can do most of the work with remote calls.
One thing this has always been a problem, and it's probably going to be even more of a problem with statically rendered diffs, is connecting anything, let's just call it anything, connecting anything to a diff file or a line in a diff file. We've always had trouble with that, particularly because the way that we identify diff files and their lines are, it's not unique. We have an open bug that demonstrates this problem, which is like when you change the file permissions of a file in Git, it shows up as two separate files, and they have the exact same ID in our system, in the system that we use. And you cannot identify which file you're looking at because the IDs are the same. If we're delivering static diffs, we need a way to identify files. And I have been pushing for unique identifiers for like 3 years. And it's a hard problem to solve on the back end, because to be able to consistently generate the same ID, you either need fully unique data under the hood, or you have to store the ID somewhere. And both of those are really hard problems. But we need unique IDs to do this, because we have to deliver the static diff file and say, this is the ID of this file. And then everything else goes to that, like discussions and line suggestions and all that stuff. We're going to have to solve that problem here.
Yeah, I have some thoughts there. I'm trying not to go too much on a tangent, but I think it's relevant here. We've discussed in the past about devising some sort of locator or address in the shape of a URL. Well, it's not a URL, but sort of like or address similar to how URIs and URLs are related, so that the URI is just an identifier. It doesn't really tell you where it is. Whereas you can have a URL, which part of the URL is a URI, but it tells you where it is or what it is or something. And essentially, we've talked about in the past having addresses, being able to comment on things beyond lines. So instead of like leveraging everything on the comments, that's why I was talking about refactoring the whole attaching comments onto the diffs. Instead of like just having a line hash and the SHAs and all that stuff, it would be something like I could attach something to a URL or some sort of like locator that would specify what type of object it is, / and then the URI of that object. Because then we can have plugins to attach, or the plugin of the discussions could be supporting multiple types of objects. And then that would have to be reflected somehow in the backend and all that stuff. But I think the point here is that by devising something as loose as that, we would be able to, for example, drop IDs on markup. Let's give it names, but for example, a diff file header would have an ID, or a diff file would have an ID, and then itself within it, I could drop a comment on file / then an ID there, and the commenter would be able to tell which file that was, which then the UID that Thomas was talking about would handle the part of the ID there, but we still be able to qualify what type of object that is. And that's for readability as well, and for just making things easier to manage, I would say, and to extend more than anything. Not that there will be clashes on the UID part, it's just that we want to make sure that we are understanding exactly and we can debug the state of the application much simpler. So that's something that's been on our minds. I think we're going to get to that when we start discussing like the actual comments methodology and mechanisms and all that stuff. But I think it goes to this topic that Tom was just talking about here. Stas?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that this is mostly a backend problem. We can't really deal with that stuff on the front end. We just consume what backend gives us and try to work with that.
Which is also being refactored in this project, right? I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that just because we've had historically kept a long, very complex mechanism of identifying lines for a comment, that's basically just giving us a relationship between comment and location, where you want to put it. It doesn't have to be that way for the diffs. Remember, we also have the context of the repository, that we have to keep in mind that there's slightly different context on how those things exist. I'm not even sure if we'll allow commenting on repository commits or on compare branches. So there will be definitely some features will be disabled depending on the context. Where was I going with this? Somewhere, but yes, just wanted to state that.
Yeah, I can add a little piece to that. You just said the diffs front end has for at least a couple of years now been using a unique UUID that is generated from the organization name, the project name, the MRID, and then a bunch of other unique information about the diff file. And that's been working really well for that viewed checkbox. Like it's not checking the wrong things. When you uncheck it, it unchecks the right file. So that unique ID is working, but that wouldn't work for source code because there's no MRID.
MR.
Yeah.
But there'll probably be a patch ID or something similar.
True.
But
yeah.
To Stanislav's point, that's the problem for backend to kind of like give us some sort of like identifier. Right. For context, Paulina and Jacques, you weren't involved in these things, but one of the problems we had with the MRs was if we were just using the file name to know what comments to put in there, the file can have a deletion of a file and then a rename of the file all in the same diff, I would say. And one of them was changing modes, like changing attributes or something. That's also part of the diff. There's a couple of instances where you can have the same file name in multiple places of the diff, that we need to go beyond just that. So we need to be very, unique, I would say.
There's also the like higher level abstraction of like if we would like to cache information locally, a file name could be shared, or a file name plus anything else could be shared on projects that you don't have access to, and we can't have that information be identified that way.
Okay.
That actually brings us.
Thought? Go ahead.
That brings us to my last point.
Before I go to the last point, I just wanted to check what Stanislav wrote here. I think it's best. What did you say?
Yeah, I think we should like try to keep the existing backend logic for now. Like I agree with your point that we really need a better identifiers for files. I actually really struggled with this when I was working on pinned file, because we don't have these identifiers anywhere in the persistent storage. So these identifiers are actually generated on the fly. And that makes it really hard to take a file from the bottom of your file tree and put it on top, because you have to load all the things before you can get this ID. And that is a really big problem. But if we'll try to pack like too many things into this effort, it will take us much, much longer than we anticipated, I think.
That's true. I think it's important to touch on this. Yeah, we're not going to rewrite the notes object as a whole, right? And potentially, like we've had already in legacy diffs, which were the first version and stuff like that, we're always going to have backwards compatibility with the previous existing systems. it's potentially just something where this new application would use this sort of like locator or whatever it was. Potentially all you would take is like a new field for the nodes, which would be the locator, I guess, because all the other part is the front end logic to place it, to show it, to display it, that sort of thing. So yes, we definitely want to tweak the existing solutions, but we don't want to be shackled by them. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Thomas, now ask you a question.
Yeah, so until recently, we've just kind of been talking about this, and just this last couple of minutes, we've been talking about how solutions could impact source code and repository and that kind of stuff. So Jacques and Paulina, you guys haven't said anything. What are your interests here? What, like, is there anything concerning that you're hearing? How is this going to impact the way that diffs are shown in source code? Either of these proposals, anything. What are your thoughts?
Let's start with Paulina.
Okay.
Anything there?
Yeah.
You felt honestly, it felt like you were about to say something right away. So that's what I just
Paulina, like, sitting back muted, and Andre is like, let's start with Paulina.
I'll let Jacques talk.
Okay. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, I'll probably have to spend some more time with it, but like my initial feeling is the 3-layered approach it was a bit easier to wrap my head around. So like I'm leaning a bit more towards that. And I think that'll also be the fact that it's easier to understand would be easier for other engineers to also onboard. That's just my initial feeling right now.
Yeah, it feels like it's going to be like a blend of the two. And for example, what I can tell you right away that plugins as a word, we try to steer away from that at GitLab as a whole, like historically. So you might want to find a better name for that particular like layer. So there'll probably going to be like some blends here and there. But have you seen anything that, from the perspective of how you've worked with diffs in the past in the repository, that you would be unable to do some things or worried about parts of it?
Yeah, my only concern really would be, like for instance, if we go with something like IndexedDB to store certain types of data, for instance, comments and things like that, like how would we handle security around that? Like for instance, if a user gets removed from a private project, would he still have access to that in the browser?
Yeah, we've talked about this in the past about cleaning caches and all that stuff. It feels like that we already do a bunch of like storing on the local storage at this moment. I think this would slightly be different because we'll be storing code in, somewhat readable way. Especially if we do the HTML caching right away. I think so. One of the things we were talking is HTML caches really well. So we could just dump the entire HTML server-side rendered, and you would never have to request the same HTML more than once using the same device. Like that's a nice idea, but then how many megabytes is that after a week using the app, right? I think I'm more concerned about that. And we talked in the past about it when Thomas did his POC. We talked about it in the past with some, I don't know if it was security or something like that. And they weren't necessarily too worried about that. I think once we start having offline access together with this and all that stuff, then remember, every caching strategy will need to have an eviction strategy kind of thing. So you're not going to be caching data forever. It's going to be just potentially for a day or something like that, or just a couple of hours or whatever, or up to a limit, right? We might like only support 3 diffs in cache or something like that. And then apart from that, we just evict the older one. So yeah, whatever caching methodology you have on the client, I think that's going to be an afterthought, not immediately immediate. I think a lot of the things is like we have in our mind, we don't want to create our architectural solutions that will block us from doing that. Not necessarily for the MVC, but it will make that achievement easier. that. So this decoupling, all of these things, that's what we're trying to do with that.
When I first raised up using IndexedDB to cache things, which by the way, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a critical piece of my proposal here. It would be nice, but we don't have to do it. But when I did raise that up and the security issues, I think it was Tim Zalman, who was like, who cares? Which is that's maybe a little that's a little more, less blasé than he actually said it. But basically, the idea was this code is already on their computer, whether it's in the browser cache or whether it's in local storage or whatever, and putting it in IndexedDB really isn't that different, other than it would just last longer. And so I'm not sure that the security is really a huge concern here, because you could already sort of cache a web page and then lose access and be able to read it again anyway. So it's something we should think about, but I'm not sure that it's like a huge deal.
Also, think about the nature of Git, right? I have the code local checked out to my computer, and I can check it out into like any computer in the world. So once I lose access to the project, the code is still there. I mean, I might lose access to my work laptop. That's more like a business company thing. But overall, like that's already a risk that exists in this sort of like industry. So potentially we could have some nuances with private projects and stuff like that. We don't know if the person is using a shared computer or not. So maybe we can have something where we would only do caching on public projects or something, but that's completely afterthought then for this project. Cool. Stanislav?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we can always clear the cache if the permissions have changed, or if we logged out, for example.
That's an interesting thing, because when you load a GitLab page, so that's probably a job for a service worker that would have to be like maintaining stuff like that. For example, when I visit gitlab.com, it would be really hard to let the browser know, hey, this user that is seeing this page was removed from part of the project X 10 minutes ago, right? Probably going to have to do a check for the project you're in right now. But from the moment you have access to that domain, you can inspect the data on IndexedDB and you can write a script to extract it or something like that. Again, let's put that in a little box and then we come back to it when we pick up local client-side caching, which is not a priority for this project. I'm much more interested in this decoupling, like event architecture that we're talking about. That would, for me, the biggest example is like telemetry shouldn't be as painful as it is today. And we can have our lives made easier if we just use that as a barometer for like decoupling things and being able to track what's happening in the application from outside, like inspecting, monitoring, just observing, basically, observing the state and the evolution of the application. Stas?
Yeah, since we are on the topic of cache, we didn't talk much about having a stable cache key for the Diffs HTML. And that is really important because it's not just the state of your diffs that needs a key. It's also the code on the front-end side that interacts with this HTML. So if we change our templates in the Rails, we actually have to bump the cache key because the cached version of in the browser will be outdated automatically. And we need to figure this stuff out.
What you're saying is whenever we change the HTML, or so for example, this is a scenario where a user has a gitlab.com open in his browser. There's a deployment that happened in the middle of the usage of diffs, and the front-end application code who's loaded into the browser is expecting a different format on the markup that is being spit out by the server after the deployment. Is that a scenario? What are you talking about?
Let's say you already have the cached diffs and already have the front-end code, and we do a new deployment with the updated front-end code. Because we'll have our HTML cached, you will get the last version, the previous version of the diffs, but with a new JavaScript. and it might not be compatible with the old version. So we need to provide a stable key, not only for the state of the diffs themselves, but also for the state of the front end of the diffs.
That's a really interesting problem, right? Because you can have multiple deployments where the templates never change. You can have one deployment where one template changes but doesn't break the front-end application. Like if I'm changing a class name or if I'm changing something like that and nothing is hooking onto that, then that change is like not drastic. So it wouldn't be worth trashing, like evicting everything in the cache. And when you say cache, I'm thinking server-side cache, right? Not client-side cache. Right?
No, this is
Or
for
both.
client-side cache. This is just for client-side cache when you have
Okay.
HTTP caching and you're caching the response to get the rest of the diffs.
Okay. Client-side caching at the tags level or like HTTP caching level.
Yeah, I've solved that previously with using Webpack's. I think it has like special constant which identifies the hash of the whole build. It basically takes the whole JavaScript output of your build and creates a hash of this. But for our case, it might not be the best thing because every single change to every part of the GitLab will trigger a cache burst, which we don't want to have.
I think that might warrant its own issue for us to discuss the details of it. We have rolled out the HTTP caching to merge requests. I'm not sure. So here's the thing.
Actually, this applies both for client-side and server. I just remembered, yes, for Redis, we need the same stuff. So Redis also has the up-to-date version.
Okay, I'll add it there.
If we work in a separate project for this code base, we could use deploys as the unique key.
So by doing that, there's always the trade-off, right? If you want to do that, you have a simpler management, simpler CI pipeline, all that stuff. But then every time you need to do a change, you're going to have to do a release or something, right? Which is what we do with the GitLab UI, right? There's a trade-off there. And now you're going to have a hurdle to go through before, you know, that's actually usable in the application. There's definitely parts that might be coming to GitLab UI. Maybe that's a conversation it's worth having. Because if we have this separation, I just had a point. I'll add a point after. Oh shit, we're out of time. I just cursed on the stream. Sorry. We're at time, folks. Should we cut it there and continue on maybe next weekly call if we have time, and then potentially having a separate call?
Yeah.
That sounds fair to everybody. I'll add a point here, GitLab UI with components if fitting for it. So yeah, let's put that pin in it. That I don't know where I was going with my last thought, but yeah, the separate project. Yes, okay. We have to talk about it, but I don't see it right away. I think because we're gonna be. But yeah, let's put that. Why am I making the separate project? Right, we can pick it up from there. Sorry, didn't want to steal the answers. I have to go. I have a call. Any last parting thoughts before we go?
Thanks for your insight, everybody.
Thanks. We're definitely going to have more conversations about this still. So this is not the end. Thank you so much, and have